Good afternoon. I'm Loretta Garcia. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Contemporary Issues Forum. Welcome to our new season of the forum. We have a few speakers lined up. We're going to do one per month this year. And we have coming up in October a session on getting out the vote with Linda Cohn of League of Women Voters. We have also, for November, we have nutritionist Mary Purdy, who is a nutritionist and runs a nutrition blog. She will be speaking about eating in a way that's healthy for the planet and for ourselves. In December, we will have two speakers speaking about medical donations, donations of medical medicines and medical equipment to developing countries, the pros and cons of that. So I will mute myself and turn it over to Kathryn, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good morning. I'm Kathryn Gargurevich, and I would like to introduce Jim Driscoll to you. He will speak about the environmental consequences of war. Jim quit teaching at MIT in 1982 to help lead the nuclear weapons freeze campaign and the American peace test, in which 13,000 demonstrators were arrested. This action helped stop the US nuclear weapons testing. Jim also works to stop global warming, and he helped found and funds and leads the Extinction Rebellion-DC chapter. Also, the BIPOC Montgomery County Green New Deal Internship Program. He is a member of the National PeaceInUkraine.org coalition. In 2017, Jim led a successful effort to get the Montgomery County Council to declare a climate emergency, which they did. And the BIPOC internship has brought new energy and breadth to the movement for climate justice. So please join me in welcoming Jim Driscoll. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Yes, I guess I'll go ahead and, I don't know, it's a small group. Maybe just go around and people say hi, and are they allowed to do that? Can they show up that way?
Let me see if I can switch to gallery from the main screen. And I forgot to ask if you can put your questions in the chat. We'll be able to read them off at the end of the presentation. So I'm now seeing a gallery. Is everyone seeing a gallery?
No.
Yeah,
No.
I am.
Okay, let me remove the spotlight from Jim Driscoll.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if that does it. How about now?
Yes, now I see.
Okay,
Cool.
great. Okay, so now everyone can see everyone, or at least up to 25.
So I'll just call off people in order, just say your name and why you're here. If you have any, just to get your 30 seconds of fame. Joan, is it Joan Brightman? Not so much.
You'll need to unmute your mic because everyone is muted coming in. And then once you speak, then you can mute yourself back on.
Okay, Jen can speak.
I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say about the war in Ukraine, because I'm naive enough to think, why are we allowing this in this day and age? The other countries just allowing Putin to be doing this.
Jason?
Yeah, I guess I have two questions. I'm Jason Haynes from Montgomery County, and I wonder what you think about the intentional flooding that I heard about recently. that was used offensively, and then also about firing up the coal plants in Europe because of the scarcity of Russian oil.
Mhm.
Dale? I think I drove the co's away by I drove two people away by asking questions. Ooh, that was a mistake. All right, Dale?
Well, I have
Please-
COVID, so I'm not going to talk a
Oh,
lot, but
no,
I
don't.
I'm just open to hearing everything you have to say. I do have a sign on my lawn saying I'm with Ukraine, simply because no one should have to suffer the war crimes that they've been suffering.
Me. Well, let me just, credentialize myself a little bit. I got it was actually in 1982 that I quit teaching up at MIT. And I was going to my decision to drop out of the academy was basically formed in significant part at a Unitarian church, the Fallen Community Church in Lexington, Massachusetts. Polly Laughlin Guild was the minister back then, the late Polly. And as you heard, I've done a lot of stuff over the last 40 years. First in the peace movement, and then social justice more broadly, and the last 10 years on pretty much largely on climate change. And usually I'm not the speaker. Usually I'm the behind the scenes person. And I usually help get things going and raise some money and so forth. And there are usually quite a few people ready and able to speak. And one more white guy from Harvard in the spotlight. Probably, we're moving away from that. But this is sort of an emergency, an emergency. I've raised $38 million in that little background way. First for nuclear disarmament, and we tried very hard to stop the first Gulf War in 1990. Had a group called Operation Real Security. That stuff at the test site, we supplemented. Anyhow, lots of good things. We won. I lived in Arizona for 26 years, and and we set up one of these citizen like progressive Maryland things in Arizona, and we won the full public funding of elections in Arizona. It was the first after Maine. It was the first state to do that. And it was great until, of course, our Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, cut out the good parts and left us what we have now. Montgomery County is the best system for public funding, but it's limited. It's can't. What you can't do is we anyhow. That's a whole long another presentation. And about 10 years ago, I got focused on climate, just because if you don't take care of climate, we can't do any of the other things. I mean, we won't even have a world to have wars on. And fortunately, we'll get a lot of wars. We'll have a lot of wars on the way through. So Polly and the Unitarian Church there played a good role. I mean, I've done a lot of, I've been able to do a lot of stuff that I feel better about than I did teaching at the School of Management up there. So I come to you today as both a peace activist and a climate activist, because I think the two are, really connected. The species, the globe, is confronted with the problem of climate catastrophe. And all the things you read in the paper are very conservative understatements, not the flooding and the fires. I mean, that's real enough. But when the IPCC says this is going to happen by then and so forth, those are all documents that have to be cleared with the State Department. They're diplomatic statements. They're not scientific statements. So they're always watered down, and we always exceed them. So we're looking at very bad, already bad things, and horrible things 5-10 years out. I mean, this idea that the end of the century is when it's going to come is wishful thinking. And so this is a time when the species needs to be coming together to deal with this problem, and sadly, the United States is not leading on that. I was arrested along with another combat. I'm a combat veteran in Vietnam. That's where I might as well do my little trope. That in the background, you see those are rubbings from the Vietnam Wall. So those are people that the three in the middle were three men, average age 19. The last thing they did while alive was to do what I told them to do, which was to go out and check out a little pagoda in front of where we had been caught. We were in a bad area. And the rest are close friends, people they're buddies, they're dead. So that's where my motivation for doing what I do comes from. And so I was arrested with this other member of Veterans for Peace in front of Chris Van Hollen's office because he votes for the military budget. And there's been a lot of excitement about this compromise that was reached with Senator Manchin from West Virginia, and talking about how it's got $400 billion for climate change. Well, yeah, but that's spread over 10 years. And so, I mean, it's good. It's good. I'm glad they have it. But that's 40 billion a year, give or take. At the same time, the military budget is 800 billion per year. So we're spending 20 times more on the military than we are on climate change, your tax dollars. And as anybody will tell you, that 800 billion is only a fraction. There's at least the last Basevich from the Quincy Institute said 1.4 trillion annually is a closer estimate of the military spending, because like nuclear weapons is not in the military budget. The VA is not in the military budget. There are many things that are military are not in the military budget. So we're not going to be able to deal with climate if we continue to pour money into the military. And so I'm going to skip that little thing on. And so you say, I can imagine somebody might say, well, what about Putin? What about the monster man who's destroying the planet and wants to build an empire and so forth, flooding dikes and slaughtering children in mass graves? Well, the one thing we know is that everything we read in the paper and the TV is so amazingly slanted. It's only one side. I mean, yeah, in a war, there are typically atrocities on both sides. We only are hearing about our atrocities. Well, you're only hearing about them. I mean, I know more the history of Ukraine and the Nazis. And I mean, Ukraine was a hellhole before the war. It was the most corrupt, blah, blah, blah. So there's plenty of atrocities on both sides. And we're only getting one side, presented, blonde-haired, blue-eyed children and women being slaughtered by this evil. But, I don't know what happens to the United States. We go, because of our peculiar role in the world, we forget. It's like, don't you remember that Saddam Hussein was the most evil man in the world and he had weapons of mass destruction, and if we didn't invade, he was going to destroy us? Well, it turns out Colin Powell and all the media and all the government was lying to us. He didn't have weapons of mass destruction. We weren't, it was about oil like it always is. At Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin, the North Vietnamese attacked our destroyer, and that's why we have to go to war, and they're awful and they're evil, and Ho Chi Minh is the worst thing, and it's propaganda. Now the Russian, both sides do it, but we're subjected to one side. And it's way past time, as a blogger that I read says, for adults in the United States to pretend that the war in Ukraine was not provoked, that we did not provoke it. Noam Chomsky did a search he always talks about. And the Ukraine war there are like millions and millions of references to how the US action in Ukraine was unprovoked. But if you search on the United States invasion of Iraq, the word unprovoked is never attached to it. And there's just been this massive switch. Okay, so what I did, and I don't know if this is a good idea or not, but to try and get some idea of what's going on in Ukraine and how the United States, from my view, is the driving force in that war. Think about the history for a while. Imagine if Russia had an agreement with Venezuela, a military alliance, and they had troops over there. And over the course of 10 or 20 years, that expanded. So all the nations in South America and Central America were part of this military alliance with Russia. And we kept saying, no, you can't do that. You can't stop at Guatemala. It's real bad. And we said, the one thing you can't do is take Mexico. And then you have a coup in Mexico to replace a US leaning government with a Russian leading government. And then two of the states in northern Mexico say they're going to be independent because they've got the Malacadoras or something, they want to stay. And so you have a couple of breakaway states in the north of Mexico. And so anti-American forces from Mexico start bombing and attacking those two states. And we keep saying, no, you can't have Mexico. You can't have Mexico. And we keep saying, all you have to do is Mexico's not part of the alliance. Anyhow, you see where I'm headed. I mean, there's a long history in the Ukraine of NATO expanding over 30 years, closer and closer and closer to Russia, and Russia saying, you can't stop, please. Well, let's have a common security agreement. Let's have peace. No, we can't have that. And all of these, beginning with George Kennan, even Kissinger, the current head of the CIA, saying Ukraine is a red line for Russia. You can't let Ukraine join NATO. That's their red line. All US diplomats. In the United States, because there's been this obsession with Russia, really for 1,000 years. It goes back to the conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the Constantinople Byzantine Eastern Orthodox religious thing. It often goes back to religion. And the line goes right down the middle of Ukraine. The western part of Ukraine has always been oriented towards Europe. It was sympathetic with Nazis. There were many people, not everyone, but there were mass murders of Jews and gypsies and communists and stuff. And on the east, they were sympathetic with the Soviet Union or with Russia before that. And Russia, right up till the end, was saying, look, just don't put Ukraine in NATO. It really didn't matter objectively. The United States, after the coup, which we engineered and bragged about and funded in 2014, we had military trainers, and we sent billions of dollars. We were making the Ukrainian army interoperable, they call it, with the US Army, doing maneuvers right on the border of Russia. But we wouldn't do that. Russia said, don't just agree that there won't be a NATO. We refused. And so then we put Russia the Ukrainian army massed their forces on these two Russian-oriented, the Donbass, it's called, parts of Ukraine. And then the Russian, in return, massed their troops on the border and said, look, you can't do that. They're going to just attack and kill all those Russian citizens. Just agree not to be in NATO. We said, no, we couldn't do it. And they invaded. I'm a peacenik. Invasions are bad. I abhor the death of, I spend time every morning, thinking about the deaths of Ukrainian citizens. And I also, not everybody probably has the same, but I think about the young people like me who are in the Russian army who are getting killed also. War's bad. And so I'm opposed to the invasion, but the notion that Russia was trying to set up an empire by invading Ukraine is nonsense. I mean, anyhow, the record goes exactly the opposite way. So, as a consequence, I mean, when I started doing this work, I worked on nuclear disarmament. This morning, I read in the paper with kind of positive spin from the Post, I understand the Times had the same thing, that Ukraine is now shelling, cities and towns in Russia. And this has long since become a war between the United States and Russia. This is called a proxy war. Austin has said we're doing it to weaken the Russians. Going back to Carter, Brzezinski had this idea that we would break Russia into smaller states. So it makes sense. There are all kinds of resources in Russia that'd be easy to get if it was not a strong military power. So there's been this long-term push to get Russia, and they've said this is an existential threat to them. Well, in diplomatic speak, that means we will blow up the world if you keep doing this, and we will use our nuclear weapons, as we would. I mean, we're the ones we have a first strike policy. We've said that we won't allow any country to emerge anywhere on the world that'll be a threat to us militarily. That's our policy. And so we are closer to a nuclear war right now than at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe ever. Dan Ellsberg and I worked on a bunch of things together, and he's got all kinds of stuff on he was a nuclear strategist, as you probably know. Some of you who are younger may not know who Dan Ellsberg is, or he's in his 90s now, sharp as a tack. And so we're allowing our government to run this risk of nuclear war for what? I mean, what would it have cost them to say Ukraine's not going to be in NATO? I mean, it's at least when they were communists and we were capitalists, there was some political stuff to argue about. So, and Biden created this. There was something like 32, somebody did a count, called neocons that he hired, Blinken being the lead one. He tried to put Blinken's partner, I forget her name, in charge instead, but this neocon, that's been their goal, is get Russia for forever. And bad enough that we're doing this to Russia, we're now doing it to China, which is probably the ultimate, economic target. All this stuff around Taiwan. We insist on driving, not just Pelosi going over there, but we drive our guided missile cruisers right by the coast of China. It's kind of like they were driving, as if Russia was driving or China was driving missile carriers, missile cruisers off Rehoboth Beach. I mean, it's a little, it's hard. We have to remember these things are thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States, and they're right on the border of Russia or right on the border of China, and they're violating agreements. We promised Russia that we wouldn't go expand NATO at all after they agreed to let Germany be unified, which if you have, I'm not a big historian, but Russia has good reason to be afraid of a unified Germany. And they said, we'll do it, but you have, and the exchange was the quid pro quo, you wouldn't expand NATO. Well, we ignored it. And in China, we have this policy of one China that will kind of all pretend that, Taiwan's okay, and someday it'll be part of China. And so we're backing away from that, looking at it for all the world. It looks like we're trying to encourage Taiwan to go through what China went, what the Ukraine is going through, so that we would have two nuclear powers. We would be, and I have trouble, since I've been doing this for 40 years. I just have trouble. I mean, how can we be so naive, so silly, so gullible that we would put our entire species at risk so that this fantasy of, dismembering Russia gets played out. So I am just going to say briefly, and I assume there's a lot of questions and comments, that right now we're trying to get the peace movement, the Progressive Caucus in Congress has a sign-on letter that asks Biden to negotiate with the Russians. The United States has been the one preventing negotiation. I mean, Zelensky and Putin had an agreement back in April. Boris Johnson showed up and said, don't do that. We have to just say to Russia, we'll cut a deal and Zelensky will do what we want. And that's what should happen. They were ready to do that in April. They did it in Minsk back in 2014. These things that always end in some kind of, an agreement, and better now than thousands and thousands of more Ukrainians get killed, in the meantime, or that we all go up in a nuclear cloud because the neocons want to keep pushing Russia. So we're asking Jamie Raskin to sign on this thing. A guy I helped elect to Congress a long time ago, Raul Grijalba, in Arizona is signed on, and I always followed his lead a lot. He's a very thoughtful fellow. And Jamie, so far, he promised to meet with me at the in front of his interns on the 4th of July. And so far, he's busy. I mean, he's does great, and he voted against the military budget that Von Holland voted for. So Jamie's a hero in many ways, and so we're hoping that he might be somebody who will start to speak up and say, well, look, wouldn't it be better to negotiate rather than sending X number more billions of dollars to have X number of thousand Ukrainians killed? And I just want to say on this, the turn in the war and so forth, I read stuff that most people don't read, including, I don't read Russian stuff, but I read Russian things that are read by. As near as I can tell, the Ukrainian advance, basically, they tried and they lost thousands and thousands of people dead trying to break through in other parts along the line. The United States gave them some intelligence that this was an defended area. They moved in and they freed up a whole bunch of land, but the Russians withdrew their troops. So there were it wasn't, they have this pretext that they're doing a special military operation. So a lot of the fighting is done by kind of National Guard people from the Donbass. There was a small number of people, they weren't strongly trained. So about this turning point, it may be, whoever knows, a war is a war, wars are complicated. The Ukrainians have lost thousands and thousands of people dead in these recent attempts to do offensives. It's quite like, in the meantime, Russia has continued to secure the Donbass, which is what they said their objective was. And now, because the United States keeps giving long-range weapons, it looks like Russia may be escalating, going after the electrical grid, going after Kiev, starting to fight a war rather than this limited sort of, geographical thing to, they say, defend those two areas. So I don't think there's a turn in the war. I think that the problem is that Russia is going to start killing more and more Ukrainians. And then Ukraine wants nuclear weapons. The United States is now talking about giving them F-16 fighter jets. It's more likely that, we might use a tactical nuke to stop Russian advances rather than the other way around. And so I'm not sure that it could be, you never know, but near as I can tell, the so-called breakthrough, got a lot of space, but didn't do a lot of military advantage. We'll see. I mean, time will tell. So I assume people have questions and comments. So why don't we just do it that way instead of my other plan?
Okay, thank you. Why don't normally we ask people to put their questions in the chat. And I did put one, but since it's a small group, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be probably fine. And then just mute yourself back after you're finished with your question.
Or you can stay on and argue. That would be great. we'll have
Well, you mentioned,
lively.
I had one question in the chat.
Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned that the US seems to be operating maybe not quite the way you thought they might, given history. And my question is, now that we're losing people to retirement, are we suffering a brain drain, a knowledge drain of some of these things that have happened? I mean, yes, everybody reads history, but it doesn't always strike people the same way if they haven't lived through it.
I wish, but I think really what we're up against is, they used to say Mexico is the perfect democracy, perfect dictatorship. Noam Chomsky, I keep talking about him a little bit. I don't know him that, barely met him. But he has this book, Manufactured Consent. The media keeps getting more and more concentrated in the hands of people who are very conservative politically. And it's just ubiquitous. And even the Silicon Valley types try, because they have to get military contracts, many of the things that I read, as soon as you read them, they get censored. They get taken off of Facebook, taken off of YouTube. It's like a real amazing propaganda machine. So I don't know. I don't think it matters that people are young or old, because Dan Ellsberg can't get on TV. Everybody probably thought he was dead. I mean, unless you're in the narrow kind of world that I'm in. And all these people that, put out alternative voices, is a little, it often happens this way in a war. At the beginning, there's this propaganda buildup and beat the drums and so forth. The military contractors are pushing it and so forth, but it changes over time. But boy, this is the worst I've ever seen it. So I think it's got to do with, that people just don't have the information. I mean, if people knew that there was a civil war going on in Ukraine since 2014, and that we were going in on one side of a civil war, people would be, oh, well, that's just like Vietnam. We'll pick the, blah, blah, blah. But they don't know that. They don't know there was a coup, even though it's out there. It's not a secret, but nobody talks about it on TV or in the New York Times or so forth. So I think it's got more to do with that propaganda system, which each country has their own. But the joke is always, in Russia, they know they're being lied to. In the United States, we think the New York Times is telling the truth. Noam Chomsky had a book of letters to the editor that the Times has refused to publish over 30 or 40 years. He called it Lies of Our Times. Because they just don't, they have that, and blah, blah, blah. But
Sure,
anyhow,
they have their editorial bent. I think Jason had a question. Jason, do you want to ask your question?
I guess in the newspapers, it's been reported that the president of Ukraine is Jewish and lost family in the Holocaust. So I wonder how that fits in with Nazis.
Oh, well, I think it's not coincidental. He was a famous comedian in the Ukraine. And he's backed by another. I think the oligarch might be Jewish also. His oligarch, the money that backed him. He ran for president interestingly on a campaign calling for peace with Russia. That he was going to end the war in the Donbass. He was a man for peace. And then he went over the Donbass, and one of these Nazi-dominated battalions, the Azov battalion. One of these guys met with him and said, "If you make peace with the Russians, we'll kill you." The president, it was on TV. It was like, and so he couldn't do what he and his boss probably wanted to do, because sadly, Ukraine has always had, going back to World War II, real Nazis. I mean, this guy Bandera, there's a whole, community and ideology that's anti-Russian, anti-gay, anti-Asian, all the things that Nazis are. And they've been influential way beyond their numbers. So Zelensky is Jewish, and he's threatened, literally, by these very violent folks that the United States, look, the United States, I just read an article on 70 years of the CIA in the Ukraine. After World War II, the United States, just like we took Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist from the Nazis, and he built our rockets for us, we took the head of the spy master for Eastern Europe for the Nazis, and we gave him to the CIA, and he just continued to run his network of spies in Eastern Europe up until the present. And a lot of them are, so they're not, I mean, we've always been willing. Look to South America, look at any place, Philippines, Saudi Arabia. You know, we work with bad actors, people who've been hurt badly by society and who behave badly. So the fact that we're working with Nazis is not like front page news. We do it all the time. And so, no, the fact that, you know, I mean, the Soviet Union was the one that beat Hitler. It wasn't the United States. It wasn't England. There were like 23 million Russians died fighting to beat Hitler, right? They mainly beat him by wearing him out. And the reason that the Soviet Union had all that quote unquote empire was because they were chasing the Nazi army back to Berlin, and that's how they got them. And they had to fight Ukrainian Nazis along the way. And so, yeah, there are Nazis there, and anybody who says there isn't, frankly, you know, anyhow. So who was the other question? Dale, somebody? Well, I guess that was you, Dale, but.
That was Jason. I don't know, Dale, if you have a question, you can post it in the comments if you don't want to ask it.
If one tried to go for peace and go to Russia, and how would frankly, I'm a big boy. I get in trouble saying this. We don't need to negotiate with Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky, it does what we tell him to do. That's what happened in April. He was ready to make a deal that everybody would still makes the logical deal, i.e. Ukraine stays out of NATO. The Donbass is autonomous within the Federation of Ukraine. They vote about what they want to be like. The same with Crimea. I mean, there's a logical kind of thing. So what we have to do is we have to negotiate with Russia because we're the ones who've got the axe to grind, you know. And so and as Kissinger of all people, here I am quoting Henry Kissinger, you know, negotiations always involve, you understand what the other side wants, you give them some of what they want. What they say they want is they want those two Russian-speaking, Russian-oriented provinces that have been attacked by Nazi battalions, among others, for 8 years now, you know, to be able to live there, you know, in peace. Like the Ukraine outlawed the Russian language in public sector jobs. I mean, you know, they tore down all the Russian, you know, they've got this get rid of Russian influence, which might make sense in Ukraine, much of which speaks Russian also. But in this eastern part, it's very Russian. And if they want to, you know, speak Russian at work or so, you know, and have their own statute, anyhow. So there's a logical kind of way to settle this thing that seems likely what Russia would settle for. But the United States won't broach that because we have this bigger agenda of destroying, frankly, Russia, turning it into a weakened non-superpower at least. And for many of them, going back to Brzezinski, breaking it up into smaller, they talk about the decolonization of Russia, claiming that Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia has colonized internal, you know what I mean? So these are people with pretty extreme goals. And sadly, you know, and look at what's the turnout for this thing today. And all of you are understandably, you'd be cold-hearted people if you weren't anti-Russian at the moment. If you didn't hate Putin for what you've read in the paper, you know, but it's just not, it's only half of the story. Putin's not a great guy. Biden's not a great guy, you know. So what would a tactical nuke look like? Well, if Russia, yeah, you just drop a little nuke on that Donbass area, you know, say, that's not what I'm saying. So say Russia has started to, it did already, it broke precedent about a week ago and fired a couple of missiles on the electrical grid over in Western Ukraine. They had said if the United States keeps giving long-range weapons to the Ukrainian forces, we're going to be forced to expand beyond the Donbass so that you can't be launching missiles into Russia like they're doing. It was in the paper today. And so if Russia was decided to really advance across Ukraine in a measured way, that initial thing up to Kiev was not an attack. It was like a thrust. It worked really well. It pinned down a whole lot of Ukrainian forces up in the defense of Kiev. And really what Russia was after was this eastern area. And so they pulled back. But Russia didn't commit near the number of people to that attack that you would if you were attacking Kiev, but you could. So say Russia now starts to expand beyond the Donbass, they start shelling Kiev, they start shelling the grid, and it looks like they're really winning big, not just winning the Donbass, which they clearly are, and that's about all over. But if they really started to expand, the United States could decide, Zelensky would beg and beg, to drop a tactical nuke as a way of stopping their advance, because the Ukrainian army is not going to be able to do it. And that would be horrible. That's what I just said. Yeah, the U.S. would use it, could use. I don't care who uses it. I mean, now, if the United States fantasy came true, and the Ukrainian army destroyed the Russian army, it's unbelievable because the Russian army most of the Russian army is not in Ukraine. They got all the regular army back in Russia. But if, this neocon fantasy was completed and the Ukrainian army drove the Russians back to the border, and the United States has given them F-16s, and we've got all, and we threatened and we basically said, surrender or die, then maybe Russia could be. I don't think that the more likely one is us, but either one, every time they war game, and the United States has now started war gaming nuclear wars again. Every time you war game a nuclear war, it ends up in annihilation. You start with one nuke, then the other one nukes, and the other one does and then strategic, and then poof. And so I don't care who, we want the thing to end. This is a confrontation between two nuclear powers, superpowers. It's never happened face to face like this. The Cuban Missile Crisis is as close as it came. And that is a bad thing. It should, you would think people would be flooding the streets saying, don't do it, don't do it. Pull back, stop, negotiate. And they just look, you have supper, and the problem is that the United States is losing its place in history, so to speak. Let me take a break. I have to take a little bit of break. So go ahead. Somebody ask a question and talk for a minute.
Well, I think probably the educated folks that I know don't think it's a realistic threat that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So that's probably why you don't see the flooding in the streets.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be not a politically astute thing to do right now.
If you read the history of nuclear weapons, and Dan Ellsberg is an excellent current source for that, the danger is not so much intentional use of nuclear weapons. We're on a hair trigger now. We're at war with Russia. So either the United States, and there have been several, I don't know what the exact total, many more than a few times, when we have avoided nuclear annihilation by sheer luck. Some low-level Soviet guy in a submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis decides not to launch a torpedo. Or the Russians think they don't have as good radar as we do. They think that well, no, actually there was a tape. They put in a tape that there was a test tape that they were going to test their warnings. They thought they were at war. So when you get to this brinksmanship kind of situation, it's not necessarily the intentional use of them. It's the accidental or unintended use. And these guys, I mean, you read Ellsberg book, it'll chill your bones. You know, that our policy is to let very low level people initiate nuclear war because they have to have orders that allow, in the case of communications blackouts, the low level people have to be able to take some initiative, and it's chilling. And so the first thing is, it's not just the intentional, but the second thing is, the United States insists that it is our policy to use nuclear weapons first, not defensively, first. It's a first strike policy, and we have it. And we use it all the time to threaten, you know, to get what we want all over the world. And so we all support that. You elect people who support that. There was that chilling interview with the new prime minister from England, where they asked her, would you be willing to start a nuclear war? She said, yes, it's part of my job. Would you really be willing to start a nuclear war? Yes, it's part of my, you could tell she had been coached. You know, it's a woman in a position of power. She has to be tough. She has to be willing to use strength, you know, blah, blah, blah. No, so don't have warm fuzzies about how the United States would never use nuclear weapons. Let us, quiz question. Which country has used nuclear weapons? Aha, the United States.
We have.
And we used them, why? Because we had to beat Japan. The 6 of us could have beaten Japan when we used nuclear weapons. We used nuclear weapons because we wanted to show the Soviet Union that we had them, and we'd use them on people. I might note, on people of color, you know, and there was no need to do Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We incinerated hundreds of thousands of people to make a political point with Russia. And I just tell you that a country that will do that, who knows what they'll do in Ukraine if they think that they're, you know, losing somehow, or losing face or whatever. And I'm glad you wouldn't go out in the streets to prevent that, but I sure am. I was arrested to try and prevent that just recently. It's, anyhow. So other questions.
Let's see, is there another question here?
How do you view internationally monitored elections in the occupied territories? Would that be preferable maybe to just negotiating between the superpowers?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not for me, but yeah, something, you know, would Russia accept it? I don't know. The agreement that with the Minsk Accords, I know them in detail, basically called for that kind of autonomous relationship between the Donbass and the Ukrainian Federation. You know, it's harder now. There's been a war. People have been killed on both sides. And so whether it was elections or not, you know, there should be elections. Like in Crimea, there wasn't elections. It probably wasn't the perfect kind, but Crimea is going to choose to be part of Russia. The Donbass, after all this, who knows? And at least initially, that wasn't the demand that they become part of Russia. It was just they had declared their independence. They said, we are little countries. We've had enough. We've been at war for 8 years. We're now independent states. And Russia said, okay, we recognize you. They called for help. We're protecting you. But so Russia wasn't trying to make them part of Russia. They were trying to protect them from an attack, and an autonomous, you know, election, internationally supervised elections could well be part of that. I mean, I'm obviously for that. The question is, what will Russia go for? And they were willing to do that in the past. Now, you know, who knows? Because they think they're winning. I mean, right, the only thing that this last thing, this last so-called breakthrough, not what was so-called, it was a real geographical breakthrough. The only thing that really did was to make the people of Russia madder at Putin for going so slow, for calling this a special military operation and not just declaring war or mobilize. They haven't mobilized. They're not at war legally. They're not doing all the things we did during World War II. And people in Russia are starting to say, let's get rid of Putin and get somebody in there who really kick ass in the Ukraine. I mean, this notion that Putin is the guy, it's all him and he's the bad, evil problem and so forth, you know, that's childish. And right now, Putin's under more pressure to mean, Putin's a legalistic, conservative, whatever, foreign policy guy, and we're better off with him than some of the guys who would like to get it done. In Crimea, they've done it for the Russians. Why do you say? Oh, because they already did. Well, yeah, like Crimea has been part of Russia forever. You know, it's got this big Russian Navy base there. They had an election of some kind of a referendum, and 90-something% of the population said they would like to be part of Russia. You can argue that that was done under pressure, and you know it should be. I'm all right with redoing it, but everything. I'm not from Crimea. You were there, and as you say, they identify with Russian. Unless something dramatic happened, that's who they would prefer to be part of. And for Zelensky really to rewrite history and say, we want to return us to our original borders, Crimea was never historically part of Ukraine. Bruce, are you new? If you heard this.
Bruce just joined. Hi, Bruce.
Question and answer time. What?
No,
Hello, I'm sorry I couldn't get here earlier.
that's okay. We're in the Q&A now. I did, Jim, just post your link that you wanted me to post.
Oh, thank you. That it doesn't sound like anybody here is going to write to Jamie, but if you would like to avoid a nuclear war, ask Jamie Raskin to meet with me, more relevantly, to sign on what's called the Jayapal letter. Pramila Jayapal is the chair of the Progressive Caucus in the House, and she has a letter which is, I find, horrible in the first 2 pages, because it's all the cover your rear end sort of language about to get people who have already committed to $40 or $50 billion to Ukraine to now, in the last paragraph, it says, we urge President Biden to negotiate with Russia to get this thing settled. And Jamie is a leader on the peace movement, but so far he's not able to. It's understandable. He wants to be he's running for Senate, as I understand it, in 2024 for Cardin seat. And so it's a hard call, but he had just voted against the military budget, which is a brave, courageous, wonderful thing. And so he's the kind of person nationally that we have our focus on. We did a little protest out in front of his office. I met with his district director on Thursday to try and get him to start to ask these questions of Blinken. And sadly, he's very busy doing wonder. You know, I think they're exaggerated things personally. I mean, I think Trump's awful, but I don't think anything much is going to come out of all this. I think it's, you know, and so, but anyhow, that's Jamie's ticket to stardom. So he's busy, but he could take a minute to sort of say, sign this letter, send a little email to Blinken or, you know, some of the people around Blinken, just say, hey, can't we get this over before we torch the species?
He also had a death in the family, so that probably
You mean not in addition to his son? You mean since his son? Somebody else died?
No, I meant his son. That was this summer.
Oh yeah, no, I know. Well, yeah, but he's moved. And he'll never move on personally from it. But he's been very, very, very. He's doing lots and lots of work at the moment. And this is part of his work is to not let us have a nuclear war. And the question is, he's going to vote in a couple of days, probably, to give another, I don't know how many billions, at 14 billion again to Ukraine, on the assumption that if we just give more weapons to the Ukraine, that'll solve the problem. And it's, I mean, maybe, I mean, they're talking about F-16s and Patriot missiles, and not in this tranche, but, you know, apparently, according to Politico, there's an article a couple of days ago, they told Zelensky to stop being so public about his demands for F-16s and to let him take care of it in more of at a lower level. But apparently there are serious conversations about giving them F-16s to offset their, because right now, like the reason these thousands and thousands of Ukrainian young people are getting slaughtered is Russia has air dominance and like a 10-to-1 artillery dominance. And so as long as the Ukrainians were in these fortified things that they had built up around the Donbass, they were relatively protected. But in order to do these quote unquote counteroffensives, they had to get out and walk along open territory. And by all reports, including the Ukrainian, thousands of them were slaughtered. And they didn't get this territory that they got is not the territory that Russia was defending particularly. It's not the Donbass. So it's horror. It's horrific. As somebody who was cannon fodder in Vietnam, I just, you know, it's inexcusable.
Well, if you want to send us the letter that you referenced, I can post it on our Facebook
it's in
page.
there. It's in there.
It's in that
It's
link.
There's a link within the link, I think.
Okay.
I don't know why that didn't pop up. Sure.
Well, you have two links.
The Jayapal letter is there.
Okay, let me see.
So
if
is there are there any, what did I do to you guys? I'm looking at a blank screen. So are there any peaceniks? Are there any peaceniks in the crowd who want to join with a few of us, not to get arrested, but at least to think about how to get to Jamie and say, Jamie, would you consider? And, you know, that from the National Peace Movement, other than getting teach-ins and protests going legislatively, it's to get people like Jamie, you know, the liberal side of the Progressive Caucus to take a lead on this. No peace, no current. I know that good Unitarians are all peaceniks at heart. And so eventually you will be on the right side of this thing.
I protested the war in Vietnam.
What?
I protested the war in Vietnam. I have not protested this one.
Well, yeah, and I'll tell you, it was me, another member of Vets for Peace, and a woman who's from Pax Christi. The three of us were the protest on Thursday. We went up to meet with Jamie's director. So it's early days. The one group, I do this work with these high school youth from Sunrise and this BIPOC internship that I set up. Young people don't have any trouble getting this, particularly young people of color. They're like, because the global South doesn't support it. You know, the sanctions are only being supported by the white European nations plus Japan and the United, you know. But if you look at India, South Africa, BRICS, South America, they're not supporting. They think that the tide has gone away from the United States and it's moving towards the multipolar kind of China, Russia, you know, that the world is no longer going to be run economically by the United States. And so they're like, what do you know, this is your fight, not ours. So it's a big, you know, it's an important shift. And as often happens when empires come to an end, it's bad for everybody around them. It's like elephants dying or something.
Are there any other questions?
Dale
Oh.
posted one.
What?
Dale posted another? Okay, let me look.
Yes, says, what leverage do we have in such a negotiation?
With Russia? Phew.
That's
Well,
on the end. That's after her question about Crimea. I don't know.
What
Maybe
what-
Dale can unmute.
the leverage we have with Zelensky is infinite. He will do what we ask. And frankly, what we do in situations like this, if we won't do what he asks, we shoot him. That's what we did in South Vietnam. And I don't advocate it, but I mean, that's what we do.
No,
So in
I
other
was
words-
talking about leverage with Russia.
Yeah, no, I was going down the line. I was just beginning with Zelensky.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. You just say, the first thing would be to say, fine, you made your point. Ukraine will not join NATO. What does that cost us? Nothing, right?
Mhm.
That has been the principle, that has been the lead demand. That's, you know, if we had been willing to say that in, I forget, it was December or January.
February.
When,
Yeah.
what?
I said February. That was when.
Well, but it was a
Russia made it.
repeated demand, and I don't know when the last one was, whether it was January, December, February. We were, you know, so that we could give him. He's been begging for what Gorbachev was looking for, a common European home. I mean, they've probably given up. With this is the good news for Biden is we got Sweden and Finland maybe into NATO. The bad news is we basically pushed Russia and China right like that. And so what Russia had been begging recently, Putin, to have a common economic security kind of arrangement that went from, I forget what it was, to the Balkan. I mean, that included Russia. And we have repeatedly said, no, we won't go for that. We won't allow that. And we win victories like Germany is going to start getting more, not we, but some rich people in the United States. The United States is going to start shipping liquid natural gas to Germany.
Mhm.
You know, and so there are some benefits, but it would be much more logical, and the United States has been opposed to it forever, for the United States, for Europe and Russia to work to, I mean, they share markets, they trade back and forth. The gas is only one example. They should be working for their own benefit and not for the United States benefit. So we could step back a little, and I mean, we have, like I said, it's almost like Zelensky, we have enormous leverage. We don't want to use it because we're using our leverage now. We've got this country that's willing, you know, everybody is saying the phrase, the United States will fight this war to the last Ukrainian. You know, we have a country full of people that under their current leadership, current arrangement of powers, will die and die and die while the United States hopefully weakens Russia. Our goal is to weaken Russia as a superpower, hopefully dismember it as a nation without having to have US forces doing any of the dying. I mean, we have we have the usual advisors and, you know, special ops people, you know, we have people in the Ukraine already, but actually and the last, I saw reports that up to 20% of the people who are involved, the fighters who are involved in this counteroffensive, were from NATO countries, not necessarily active, you know, recently released kind of, you know, but you know, with different, they switched the patch on their uniform. So there are already significant numbers of NATO personnel in Ukraine supporting the war, but, you know, so far, of course, the United States and NATO is saying we're not sending forces.
Well, Ukraine is not ours to give. Ukraine has asked to join NATO. We can't say, okay, Russia, we'll accede to your demand. It's
Au
not
contraire,
for
NATO is
us.
totally, NATO is ours. NATO does what we want. We created NATO. We're in charge of NATO. Now, it may be one of the great accomplishments of this whole fiasco is and from Russian or anybody in Eastern Europe, Germany is now going to militarize. All this time after Hitler and after World War II, Germany is saying, we're going to step up and take our rightful place as the leader in Europe, and we're going to build a big military. But at the moment, the United States, NATO does what the United States wants. So we could say either yes or no to some, and frankly, the decision-making structure at the moment where they're trying to change it is any one nation can veto the addition of a new nation to NATO. There was some hope that Turkey, I don't know if you remember back, that Turkey was going to say no because of, and they wouldn't let, was it Finland, I think, in because Finland wasn't being sufficiently mean to the Kurds, the Kurdish rebels that were up in, probably taking refuge or asylum or something up in Finland. But then Turkey, so if the United States just following the rules, ignoring the fact that we pay all the bills and they'll do it, we train them all and they love, you know, that it's like this, we legally have the right just to say no. We say no, and then Ukraine couldn't join NATO. I'll tell you, this is sad. We as a people benefit from this arrangement. I'm not enough of an economist to know, but the fact that the world's economy runs on the dollar means that everybody on this call now lives richer than we would if the world's economy was on a basket of goods that included the Chinese and Russian and South African, whatever. And so we are richer as a result of this military arrangement. And I think sometimes we don't like to look at that, you know, when we have our fancy birthday parties like we're having for our grandchildren, and we go off to our summer vacations and, you know, live high on the hog internationally. Partially, some part of that is because of the economic arrangements that our military imposes. And that's a tough sell. I mean, to realize that, you know, people will live poorer in the United States if we give up this military dominance.
Well, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, we'll let our speaker go, and thank you for speaking with us today.
Coming in, what is it you're supposed to, what is it? You comfort the afflict and afflict the comfortable.
Right.
So here I come to, yeah, you're doing something wrong again, you US, or you nice white US people. But sadly, we are doing it again, and some of us have to stop it. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Take care.